All right, everyone, welcome to our final session. This is session 5, where we are going to go through the 60s almost to the end of the 1980s, session 5. Make sure that you do fill out the discussion questions as well as the paper. Also make sure that you take a look at some of the postings I posted in the announcements, like APA guide. Some of the papers still aren't using APA real well. Make sure you take a look at that. So without further ado, let's get started. So we will start with Johnson's Great Society in Vietnam. We ended off with the Cold War, and we're going to dive right into one of the big conflicts of the Cold War, which is the Vietnam War that President Johnson helped to escalate, but we'll get to that. So let's get started. So the election of 1960 was basically rich and handsome versus middle class and whiny. So this was the first election to actually have a televised debate. Kennedy came off, and he was a rich, handsome man, married to a beautiful woman, and he looked good on TV. Nixon was the vice president of Eisenhower, and he basically looked kind of whiny, and he was married to a plain woman. Television showed the difference between these two. This was where you really had the transition from a kind of radio-based media to a TV-based media. So before this debate, Nixon had actually hurt his knee, had infected, was in the hospital, and had just gotten out a couple weeks earlier, where you have Kennedy, who actually went on vacation, got a tan. So when this debate took place, you were seeing this nice, tan, healthy-looking man going against Nixon, who wore a jacket that was basically the same color as the set. So he kind of blended in with the set. He also didn't wear makeup. Kennedy wore makeup, so he wouldn't basically shine in the lights. You could see Nixon sweating, where Kennedy looked very healthy. So when people watched this, they saw Kennedy as vibrant and young and probably the better man to be elected. But people listening on the radio actually felt that Nixon won the debate. So this is where you see that visuals and the way you look really can make a difference on who gets elected president. So after the election, basically, it was also pretty close, but Kennedy did win. So Kennedy's was inaugurated in 1961. A lot of the country was very excited that Kennedy was elected. He was a strong, young, vibrant man compared to the previous administration of Eisenhower, who was seen as kind of this fatherly character. The Kennedy administration basically was called Camelot, a musical that came out about the same time about King Arthur's kingdom. His administration was full of vigor and hope and looking to make things better. Also, President Kennedy called for Americans to push on with a new frontier of challenges. So one of the things that he stated was landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. One of the things that he called for. That's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. A very powerful man when he's giving out his message. So you have one of the first clashes with the communists. That was one thing that people thought, that maybe he was going to be weak on communism. So in 1959, under Eisenhower, the island of Cuba falls to communist rebels that overthrow the U.S.-backed dictator Batista, and was overthrown by Fidel Castro. Basically, Eisenhower didn't do anything about it, so Kennedy decided to do something about it. Kennedy approved the invasion of Cuba with anti-Castro Cubans trained by the CIA. Basically, the idea was that the Cuban people would side with the Americans and help them overthrow Castro. The problem was that at the pretty close to invasion time, Kennedy kind of backed off and changed his mind on things, and basically the invasion failed. One thing that they assured that the rebels would have was air cover, and not wanting to prompt the Soviet Union into a bigger conflict, Kennedy pulled off the air cover, which just basically meant these guys landed with no air cover, and they couldn't really establish a beachhead or superiority on the beach, so the invasion failed. So April of 61, the invasion failed, and the invaders are quickly captured. If you guys think of basically conspiracy theories, this is one of the reasons why some people think that Kennedy was assassinated, was because he failed to stop the communists or failed to help these rebels overthrow Castro. So you can look it up, but it's kind of interesting. So I've moved myself out of the way here so you can see the full PowerPoint. So let's go on. So the Cuban Missile Crisis takes place in the summer of 1962. Oops, looks like I'm also cutting off some of the PowerPoint, which you can get. I will post it so you can see it there. So the Cuban Missile Crisis takes place in the summer and fall of 62. Summer of 62, the Soviets began building nuclear missile sites in Cuba. We also were building missile sites in Turkey, our NATO ally, which is right there on the border with the Soviet Union, so it just made sense for the Russians and the Soviets to do it. So JFK had a choice to destroy these sites in Cuba, start probably the Third World War, or do nothing. So that date is wrong. It's October of 62, not 63. So Kennedy got tough and blockaded Cuba. Basically, a naval blockade, surround the island, don't let anybody in. Blockaded Cuba and turned ships away carrying materials that could have been used or were used to build those missile sites. He also demanded that the existing sites be dismantled. The Soviets backed down and removed the missiles from Cuba as long as the Americans promised that they would not invade. This is probably the closest we've come to an actual possible nuclear war. My dad actually joined the Navy in 1957 and was on the beach in Florida looking out to where the Cubans could have come, or the Soviets and the Cubans would have come if they decided to invade the United States. He was there to guard the beach. They gave him a rifle, but they didn't give him any ammunition. So he was guarding the beach with a gun, but no ammo. And when we asked him about it, he said, "What would you have done if you saw the Cubans and the Soviets coming?" He said, "Thrown down my gun and ran." I mean, there really wasn't anything to it. He couldn't have done anything, really. So that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So even though Kennedy stood up on the Soviets, he was still having a lot of problems getting his programs passed. Even though he was a popular president, a lot of his social and civil programs were making very little progress. And in 63, he was getting geared up to run for his second term. He went to Texas to hope to improve his standing there. And while he was riding in Dallas, he was shot and killed by the assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. Camelot was gone, and Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States after Kennedy was pronounced dead on November 22nd, 1963. So Lyndon Baines Johnson was basically a Washington insider. He was first elected to Congress in 1931 and was made majority leader in 1955. In order to help him win Texas, Kennedy tapped him as vice president so he could help win that election. Texas has a lot of electoral votes. You need him to win. So after the Kennedy assassination, Johnson basically helped complete a lot of proposals that Kennedy had put forth, like Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, the Peace Corps, Head Start, and the Wilderness Preservation Act. So basically he was promising to continue Jack Kennedy's policies as president. So a lot of people think that President Kennedy was the one that actually was the one who ended segregation and was big on civil rights. It was actually President Johnson was the one who worked towards it, because he knew the people within the House and the Senate and knew how to work them so he could get what he wanted across, or get the legislation across. So you have him signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So in 1960, to go back in time, Johnson was on the record saying that he agreed with Jim Crow segregation, but the whole idea of it sickened him. Johnson knew that the future of the Democratic Party was going to be in the North and the West, where many of these African Americans immigrated to. The Civil Rights Act ended segregation in public schools and ended white and colored signs. It was the first federal legislation directed to end racial discrimination since Reconstruction. So, question, something to ponder: did Johnson end segregation because it was the right thing to do, or did he do it for political reasons? That's a good question. So the election of 1964, this is when Johnson basically ran on his merits instead of saying, I'm continuing the Kennedy presidency, this is going to be my presidency. So the Democrats hold their convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, which is a pretty rundown place, still sort of is, unfortunately. Democrats wanted to address that there was a great poverty problem in America. The Republicans run Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. He is an anti-New Deal, Fair Deal, and New Frontier person. He is linked with the John Birch Society, who believed that the world was under communist control. Conspiracy theories, basically. Many members of the John Birch Society were also anti-Semitic and racist. Goldwater was neither, but basically Johnson's campaign used it to help him win. Also, if you want to look it up, there is a video, and I'll post it on the blackboard, of President Johnson's, one of his more famous, if not probably the most famous commercials of that time was, I think it's called the Daisy commercial, and basically he was saying that Goldwater would start World War III. I'll post it on there. It's pretty powerful and pretty weird. So, but basically, using all that against Goldwater on Election Day, 1964, Goldwater is soundly defeated by Johnson. And in fact, Johnson's victory was bigger than Roosevelt's victory in 1936, because Goldwater only won his home state of Arizona. So, now that Johnson has his own presidency that he has as his own, he won it by himself as to be president. He's no longer living on Kennedy's and promising to pass Kennedy's legislation, keeping the Kennedy presidency alive. It was his turn. So in the next section, we will be talking about President Johnson's Great Society and what upended his policies for the Great Society.